Good morning and welcome to our webinar, Understanding the Most Challenging New Hours of Service Rules. Today we will be focusing on the 30-minute rest break and split sleeper berth to get you prepared for those hours of service changes coming up on September 29th. My name is Brittany Wooten, Marketing Manager for EROAD, and I will be facilitating the webinar this morning. Before we begin, let me review some housekeeping items. We will have about a 40-minute presentation and leave time for questions and answers at the end. If you do have questions during the webinar, please submit them in the question box on the side panel, and we will get to them at the end. As always, we will be recording the presentation today and emailing that out so you can revisit or share the content as you wish. Presenting today, we have Susan Rosinski, EROAD's talented training manager. Susan brings knowledge from both carrier and driver perspectives with a deep understanding of carrier operations. Susan acts as a translator extraordinaire when it comes to explaining our complex solutions to customers. And we also have a very special guest, Carrie Workowski, CVSA's Director of Roadside Inspection Program. Carrie has over 30 years experience in enforcement and training. Prior to CVSA, she worked for the Ministry of Transportation in Ontario, Canada, where she was responsible for developing training curriculum and updates for enforcement staff, as well as advising both enforcement and the industry on commercial vehicle related issues. We are super excited to have Carrie on today, so thank you so much for being here with us to share this information. And with that, Susan, I will pass the torch to you to get it started.
Welcome, everyone. I'm very excited to do this training today with the new rules that are coming up in less than 2 weeks. So we put this together because with the split sleeper being the most challenging, I think, of the hours of service rules to understand, and now with more drivers having the capability of having more flexibility with the 7 and 3 added the 8 and 2, I think it's very important that we cover this in detail. I used to train on the split sleeper by just telling my drivers not to do it, but that's not a good way to train. So I'm glad we have Carrie with us today because it does get a little bit challenging when you start mixing stuff up. So what we're going to cover, we're just briefly going to go over the new rules, the timeline, the applicability, and then a brief review of all 4 changes. Then we'll get right into that 30-minute interruption of drive time. Note, it's no longer going to be called the 30-minute rest break because it's not actually a rest break, it's drive time, has to do with drive time. And I'll let Carrie talk to that a little bit more. Then we'll get into the sleeper berth provision, give you some great examples and great visuals, then some roadside enforcement questions, very specific, and then a Q&A session, which Brittany said, please, when you think of something, just enter that in and we'll make sure we try to get to everything that we can that you're asking. So the timeline. So the new rules become effective September 29th, 2020. Now, if your ELD provider is turning on a quote unquote practice of the new rules on your ELD, note the drivers can do that. They can use the new rules in practice mode. However, they're not going to be compliant if they're utilizing or using those to calculate their hours of service prior to. And the switch time is going to be midnight Eastern Standard Time. So depending on what time zone you're in, your rules might go into effect on the 28th. So make sure you keep that in mind. But there's some caveats to that, and we're going to talk about that as we go through this with Carrie about enforcement and what would be a best practice for that switchover. As far as EROAD goes, we're not going to make that switch before the time. Drivers are drivers, and we don't want there to be an accidental, quote unquote, use of the rules beforehand. So we're making some changes with messaging and training videos and things like that to make that switchover automatic as of midnight Eastern Standard Time. The drivers don't need to do anything, but it will not be turned on prior to that. So again, make sure you train your drivers. These rules go into effect on the 29th. And Carrie, do you have anything to add to that about that switchover date and time?
No, not at this point.
Okay. So applicability. If the drivers are currently using hours of service rules and using your time cards or your logbooks, and they're involved in interstate commerce, they'll be able to use those new rules on September 29th. So, Carrie, what about intrastate drivers?
Well, that's a good question. Most of the states at this point, from who I've talked to, are adopting it intrastate, but there are some states that are not. So my best advice to carriers that are operating within a specific state contact your specific state and find out whether or not they are adopting all the rules, parts of the rules. The one that obviously most people that are operating intrastate are curious about is the short haul, and whether they're going to go from 100 to 150. And I really can't give you a list of states at this point. You just need to contact the local jurisdiction and find out.
So the local FMCSA field officer or their local DOT?
Local DOT for the most part, because the FMCSA office could potentially only deal with interstate commerce, and you really need to talk to the local jurisdiction enforcement agency to find out what they're doing for intrastate. Like for an example, I called California for a member of ours, and California at this point is not adopting the new rules for intrastate, but I contacted Oregon for somebody else, and Oregon is. So that's, I mean, I'm finding out just the same way that you would contact the officials in that state.
Okay, so September 29th, we're going to be talking about 4 interstate carriers, and then with the caveat with what Carrie just said, if you know 100%, you've checked with your state DOT and they say they are adopting, that date does apply to you. Otherwise, it does not. So what we're talking about here, interstate hours of service rules. Okay, so a brief review. There's 4 changes, and there's been lots of information put out on this. FMCSA has done a great job with training and getting this information out. So the short haul exception, it's expanding that air mile location from 100 to 150, and then that work shift goes from 12 hours to 14 hours. You're still not required to take the 30-minute rest break. EROAD has an automatic feature for our smart short haul where the driver will automatically get kicked out. So if they are kicked out, then they will be still required to take that break under the new 30-minute rest break rules, so only after 8 hours of drive time. We'll get into that in a little bit more when we talk about the 30-minute interruption drive time. The adverse driving exception, the driving window goes from an 11 to 13, so they can do that, and now they have, instead of a 14-hour window to get that driving done, they go to 16 hours. So they still need to take that 30-minute rest break if they've accumulated that 8+ more hours of drive time. But the cool thing with this, with that 30-minute rest break, is right now, if the driver takes a break really early in his day and then they enable the adverse driving exception, you know, they might need to take another break. So with this, they don't need to do that. So it's only 8 hours of cumulative drive time. So adverse driving, another 2 hours for that window. And then the 30-minute interruption of drive time, which we'll get into this in detail, only required now after 8 hours of actual drive time. And then they can take that break in an on-duty period. So line 4, on duty, not driving, 30 consecutive minutes now is going to reset that break timer. And then the sleeper berth provision, that 10-hour required rest period, is now 8 and 2 split with 8 hours in the sleeper plus the other 2. They can now add a 7-3 split, giving the driver more flexibility. And that smaller period now, that 3 hours or that 2 hours, does not count against the 14-hour driving window, or you can look at it like it stops it. So the drivers, just like they are now, they could just use a one-off if they need a little more flexibility for one day. They need to break up that 10 hours, or they could roll it into several cycles. And that's where it gets super fun. And Carrie will go into that in more detail here. So just briefly, the ELD mandate, those rules have not changed at all. What we're talking about here is the hours of service rules changing. So for an ELD provider, we're not required to do these compliance counters or these tools assistance for the hours of service for drivers, but with a lot of devices, they do have these timers that has to do with your drive time, that shift or that work window, and then your weekly cycle times. So this is something that I want you to be aware of with training. So it's how the driver is going to interact with your ELD. So we have the EROAD home screen here, which shows you the drive shift and the cycle time. Now, the drive time, there's nothing changing there. That will say 11, except if they enable that adverse driving condition, then the 11 goes to 13, and now that shift will go from 14 to 16. So if they enable short haul, again, drive time will stay the same. That shift is going to stay at 14. So you want to make sure your drivers have, like you see here, that short haul icon to show them that they have short haul enabled. And then cycle and shift and drive, all those could change pretty interestingly with the split sleeper, depending on what part of that split sleeper cycle the driver is in, and Carrie will go over that. But just make sure that your drivers are aware of, no matter what device you're using, the logic behind what's feeding these duty statuses and how they're going to look, because your device is going to change when it's counting these things. So when I was testing, we've done some extensive testing to make sure that the new rules are going to work for our EROAD customers and drivers. I got a little confused with some of the things, and so I'm very visual. So if your drivers get confused, just have them go to the logs icon from the home screen, or looking at your regular graph grid log, whatever device you're using, and have them look at their hours that way. They're used to looking at that. It's comfortable. I'm visual. I like, with the split sleeper especially, to look at the graph grid log to kind of see what's going on. So if these counters are confusing your drivers, they're just numbers, make sure you train them how to go back the old-fashioned way, look at their logs to do their calculations. So the 30-minute interruption of drive time. So the current rule, 30 minutes off duty must be taken after starting their shift, being on duty for 8 hours. So Carrie, what's that new rule look like?
So the new rule is allowing a driver to use on duty not driving to satisfy that break. So currently you can't do that, and the on duty time actually counts into the 8 hours. In the new rule, as of the 29th, a driver can take his interruption in drive time off duty in the sleeper, or fueling. They can use personal conveyance, because personal conveyance is an off-duty standard. Yard moves is an on-duty line item. So any of those items other than driving can be used to satisfy that 30 minutes.
Great, and it must be consecutive time. The current rule, lines 1 and 2, so you have your off-duty sleeper berth. That's where the consecutive 30 minutes is. Now we're adding line 4, right? The on-duty, not driving, where as long as it's consecutive, you can have any combination that you could think of, as long as it doesn't include the line 3, the drive line, correct?
Right. A prime example of that in my mind for practicality would be when a driver stops for fuel. He stops for fuel, he fuels for 15 minutes, and then he goes off duty for 15 minutes, goes into the truck stop, might have a quick snack, go to the bathroom, whatever. That whole time frame equals a half an hour. It's 15 minutes of on duty time right into 15 minutes of off duty time, which is 30 minutes of consecutive time, which would satisfy a break. That is actually made up of 2 different lines, line 1, line 4.
Right, but if he goes and he's fueling, that's on duty, he moves to truck and he goes into a drive status, then goes in for a break, you have maybe a minute or 2 of drive time, maybe 3. What happens there?
Nothing. His drive time adds towards his existing whatever many hours of driving he has, and he still needs to take a 30-minute break a 30-minute interruption in drive time at some point before he reaches that maximum of 8 hours of driving. So if he breaks that time frame, he loses the opportunity to use that time frame as a break.
Great. So just great training point for your drivers. Make sure they know in that scenario that it has to be consecutive time. So if you're going to fulfill that 30-minute consecutive period using multiple different duty statuses from lines 1, 2, and 4 on duty now, make sure your drivers know they can't interrupt that at all with any drive time. So short haul drivers. So with EROAD, our smart short haul, if the driver is kicked out of the exemption for going over, the new rule would be 14 or the 150 air mile limit, then they're required to take that break. But note, it will be based on the new rules. So with your operations, if you're going to expand your operations because you've got a lot more miles to drive, it could be potentially that your drivers are driving more. Make sure they know that after 8 hours of drive time, they're going to need to take that 30-minute rest break. And it could be in any duty status, but just think about this. If they don't take a break during the day and they get towards the end of their day, I'd hate for them to have to interrupt and have to take a break at 13 and a half hours out. So it might be some time management training with your drivers there, with your short haul drivers, with this expanded time and location that they have with the short haul rules. So that 30 minutes still applies if they're kicked out of the short haul exemption. So what does it look like? So the 30-minute interruption of drive time, this was something I wanted to share when I was testing the rules, and this is just the driver's interaction with the device with the new rules. That could be a little bit confusing for your drivers. So after September 29th, the drivers will be able to have this drive counter that's on the drive screen, but it's only counting down with drive time. So note that any on-duty period of 30 consecutive minutes is going to reset that counter to 8. So we'll show you a visual of this on the graph grid log in a moment, but your driver starts at 8 o'clock, right? They go into an on-duty period. Normally, right now, that counter, when they start driving, say they do a 30-minute pre-trip, they start driving, that counter is going to say 7 hours, 30 minutes until break due, because it's counting that on-duty time. But what's going to happen after September 29th is they get in, they go on duty, it starts at 8 hours and 00. They do 30-minute pre-trip inspection, they get in, it's still going to be at 8 hours and 00 because that on-duty time is being counted, or it's being counted as towards a break, and it's not drive time. So this counter here on the EROAD ELD is only going to count down with actual drive time. So 8 hours of drive time, that is going to get closer and closer to 0. That's when the driver needs to take their break. But then, they stop, they unload, like Carrie said, they fuel, they're doing training, any other on-duty activity, the driver gets back in the truck and it's going to say 8 hours and 00 minutes. So make sure you explain to them with whatever system you're using that break timer, it might be a break timer, here we have until break due, that now is only counting down when the driver drives, not everything else. So here with the EROAD ELD, you have the break counter here, it says until break due. If the drive time supersedes that, or the shift time left or the cycle time left, it will say that underneath. So show the drivers those words. If it says until break due, that has to do with the drive time counting down. If it says drive time, that has to do with the 11 hour, the shift time is that 14, and the cycle time are your weekly totals. So the timer is going to show the shortest time left to violation, so the drivers know which rule they're going to break and what action they need to take. So again, it's just interacting with this and the drive screen counters and also those compliance counters on the home screen or whatever you're looking at. Do the training, make sure your drivers know, because it can be a little bit confusing and you might save yourself some calls and your drivers some frustration if you work it through with your training beforehand. So visually, here's what it looks like. So your current rule, you have the top graph grid log here. You have your calculation point starting at your day at 10 a.m. So then you go 8 hours out here at 6 p.m. You'll note the driver has not taken a 30-minute off-duty period, so they are in violation when they drive. So with the new rule, the top and the bottom, you note here you go at 10 a.m. the driver has an hour. He's doing a pre-trip. He's loading, doing whatever he's needing to do. The new calculation point for your drive time is going to be 11 because there's 30 minutes of on-duty time, right? So then you can go from there 8 hours. Here that driver carry is still in violation, right? Because you have the 5 hours and then 6, 7, 8 at 9 p.m. they drive, right? Mm-hmm. So they're in violation there because even with the new rule, after 8 hours of drive time, they don't have a new on duty, or do all of those on duty periods like from 4 to 6, does that now count, extending that time period out from 6 p.m.? Does that make sense? I told you I talked too fast.
Under the current rules was your question?
No, so that top log, right?
Yeah.
So the current rules, the driver's in violation no matter what, because they didn't take that 30-minute break. With the new rules though, even though they've had 8 hours of drive time there, they're not going to be in violation at 9 p.m., right? Because all those on-duty periods now count?
Right. So that 2 hours between 4 and 6 is a 30-minute, at least a 30-minute interruption in drive time. So your counter would start over again at 6 p.m.
Perfect. Okay. Yes. Sorry about that. I got a little ahead of myself. So you have from 11 to 4, you have drive time. And even though those total hours say 10, just look now on line 4 to see if there's at least a 30-minute period there that would then reset that timer to be at the end of whatever that period or that duty status would be for the on duty. And then that lower graph grid, so you have here the driver only drove 6.5 hours. All of those on duty periods on line 4 are resetting that 8-hour clock for the drive time. So anything else, Carrie, for here that you'd want to add and let people know about?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking of two things actually. The one with the short haul exemption, although you are exempt from the 30-minute break, odds are that if you go over that 14 hours or the 11 hours of driving and you kick yourself out of short haul, the majority of the drivers I ever stopped in my life that were operating under short haul are usually doing multiple deliveries, and one of those deliveries at some point generally is over a half an hour. So that, I would say 99% of the time, the change to this rule is going to really help drivers satisfy the rule, because most drivers, unless they're long haul, are going to stop somewhere for a half an hour, whether it's loading, unloading, checking the load, going to the bathroom, fueling, or whatever. So it's good for the drivers because I don't think they're going to have to think about it that much. I mean, the ELD will prompt them, but unless you're a long haul driver sitting behind that wheel for 8 straight hours, you're probably going to satisfy this rule simply just by doing your day.
Right. So if they're not using an ELD and they're on a paper time card, just make sure that that driver marks all of those on-duty periods to make sure and that they've satisfied that during an audit then when they would be reviewing those records?
Right. Exactly. Yes.
Okay. Perfect. And now switchover time. So this is a great question when we talk about the 28th and the 29th. So the 28th, folks, is going to be a Monday. So your drivers are going to start out. Those rules go into effect Eastern Standard Time Tuesday. So if the driver starts on Monday, they have on-duty drive and on-duty time, so no off-duty period until midnight. At midnight, do they have to take a break at that time so they get pulled over, or what's enforcement going to do? How would they deal with that situation if the driver's doing one thing one day and then trying to apply it to the next day?
I mean, in this case here, when you've got them changing from one rule into the next, I mean, if I was going to look at the 28th, when the inspectors look at the 28th, they're going to be applying the old rules. So the old rules do not incorporate the on-duty not driving as part of an interruption in drive time. So they're not going to look at it that way. So in this particular case, the driver should take a 30-minute break at midnight if he's at 8 hours at that point. And I mean, we were talking about this early, Susan. I mean, my honest suggestion to industry is give it a day. You've been running under the old rules for years and years and years. So when we get into the sleeper berth next, it becomes even a little more arduous and complicated. My best suggestion is just wait until midnight, even though it comes in midnight and the 29th, give it a day, and then you're fresh and going. Or if your driver is off duty at midnight on the 28th, then if he's off duty for 10 hours, he can come back in and now he's on the new rules. So that's my best suggestion, because this is just as arduous and difficult for the enforcement folk to understand as it is the industry folk. So, you know, if it's complicated for you, understand that it's complicated for enforcement. So to make it less complicated in this transition, operate under the old rules for an extra day. It honestly is my suggestion, and then nobody will have any issues at all.
Right. And you know, that is what we're thinking, and you could actually implement a company policy just for the switchover that you let all the drivers know, maybe like, okay, we're going to practice until October 1st, and October 1st everybody is okay to use the new rules. So, you know, however you want to do it, because us being ELD providers, we have to think about all these little kind of nitpicky things. You know, what happens in the switchover? What about this? What about that? But for you guys, you just make it easy for yourselves. Just, you know, like Carrie said, wait another day or two, get some practice time in with the stuff. And then if your drivers come to you with these types of scenarios, which they will, just have something prepared to tell them, like, hey, you know, we're just going to start everything on the 28th, which is Tuesday,
Right.
or Wednesday, or a new date, October 1st. Have a company policy to back you up.
The nice thing about all of these changes is they're all to the benefit of the motor carrier. So if you run under the old rules for an extra day, you're not going to be in violation of any of the new rules, because the new rules are more advantageous in every scenario. So for instance, if you stay at short haul for 100 miles, nobody's going to penalize you because you didn't branch out to the 150 miles until the 30th of September. And similarly, if you use the old sleeper berth and you're assuming that your 8 and 2 is your only option and your 2 is still being added into your work shift. Even if the inspector on the 29th goes, oh no, your 2's not added in anymore. Okay, well, then you're more compliant than is actually required, which is fine. So there's nowhere in the new rule that if you follow the old rule for an extra day that you're going to be held responsible for something on the 29th. It's just not there.
Great. Yes. So stay on the safe side. Now here's the fun one. Is everybody ready? Sleeper berth provision, and Susan's new focus for training is not telling the drivers not to do it, but go ahead and use it and do it and train on it, because I do think it gives the drivers quite a bit more flexibility. The current rule, so the required 10-hour break can be obtained with those 2 separate periods. 8 hours have to be in the sleeper berth. The other 2 off duty can be sleeper berth, off duty, a combo. Just as long as they pair that, they'll get that required 10. The shorter break, that 2 hours, does count against the 14-hour shift limit. So they're just getting that 8 hours added back or not counted in. And then they could record 2 hours of off duty riding in the vehicle after 8 in the sleeper berth. So those are your team drivers. So the new rule, you have that 10-hour break. The 8 and 2 is still there, and now they can add a 7 and a 3 combo. So same types of things. The 7 has to be in the sleeper berth, and then the other 3 can be a combo, just as long as it's consecutive. And then when that's paired, that's going to fulfill that 10-hour break. So cool thing, new thing. So Carrie, you want to talk about either of those periods then, not counting against the 14-hour shift limit?
No, I think actually I'll wait until I get into the graph grids, if you don't mind.
Okay, I don't mind. So here we go. So visual. So you guys ready? We're going to get into visual stuff, and then Carrie, take it away here. And yes, that 14-hour stop and what that looks like.
All right. So altogether, I'm going to show you here 3 different days of graph grids. So right now we're on day 1 and day 2. So I'm just going to work through the graph grids and show you how these rest periods will now work as of the 29th. So we'll start with pretending like this driver had 10 straight hours off, so he's starting fresh on day 1. And then we have a rest period there. So it's 2 hours in length. So because we have a rest period of 2 hours in length, based on what Susan just said, 2 hours is an option to use, providing we can find something to pair with it that is 8 hours or greater, because we have 2 minimum. We have to find 8 hours in the berth. So we look ahead. We have 15 minutes off. That doesn't help him with pretty much anything. It doesn't help him with the 30-minute break, and it doesn't help him with the sleeper berth split. But then we come up with this time frame in the sleeper berth, which is 8 solid hours. So now we have a 2 and an 8. That equals 10. That meets the requirements of the sleeper berth provision. So we start to count after the 10 hours the driver had off. We start here where the green line is, and we stop at the beginning of the second berth that is paired with the one in the middle. Now here's this part doesn't change. This is the 11-hour violation. So we count up all the drive time. He's only allowed to drive 11 hours on either side of that first rest break. And we get to an 11-hour violation at 1600 by adding up those 3 blue lines. That doesn't change. That's the same as it is today. Then we add up the 14-hour rule. So today, you would include that 2 hours from 6:15 to 8:15 in the 14-hour rule. And by the time he gets to that berth at 4:30, he would have been at 14 hours and a half in his work shift. That's too long, and he would have actually been in violation at 4 p.m. today. But as of the 29th, he is going to not have that 2 hours included into his work shift. So when we add the time ahead and behind, and we're adding lines 3 and 4, so driving and on duty for the purposes of the 14-hour rule, we're going to get to 12 and a half hours of on duty time only. So he is not in violation of the 14-hour rule as of the 29th of September. And then there is also no 30-minute break violation, because we're only adding up the drive time, and we have that 15 minutes comes out of the time that we're adding up for the 30-minute break. So we're actually only at 8 hours right on the nose for the 30-minute break, and then he goes into the berth. So that 8 hours berth rest period satisfies the berth split, but it also satisfies the 30-minute break. So then we move along. And sleeper berth, what we need to do is we need to find out where are we going to stop counting again for our next sleeper berth split. So we put our start line at the end of that 2-hour rest period that we used, and we look forward. Now we have an 8-hour in the berth. So we need at least 2 hours of off duty or in the berth to marry to that 8 hours. So we look ahead, and actually we have 2 rest periods in here. We have a 3-hour and we have a 2-hour. FMCSA's guidance and the enforcement folk will always look at a driver's log and give the benefit of the doubt to the driver, give all the benefit to the driver that they can. So when there's 2 different rest options there to use, the most beneficial one to use for the driver is always to stop the clock as fast as you can stop the clock. If I go over to the second one, the 2 hours, because it would work with the 8 as well, then I'm going to go all the way over to 7:45 in the morning, and I'm going to include that 3 hours in my work shift calculation. I don't want to do that because that's going to put more hours into the driver's work shift. So I want to stop at 4:15, and I can because the 8 and the 3 is at least a minimum of 10. I've got 8 in the berth and I have 3 off duty. So it meets the requirements of the sleeper berth split. So now I've got my stop line at 4:15. I add up my drive time, and I have no 11-hour rule violation because I'm counting everything ahead of the 8 hours berth and everything behind the 8-hour berth to my stop line, and I'm at 10 hours and 3/4. Then I add up all my on-duty time and drive time, and I end up at only 12 hours of on-duty and drive time in my 14-hour rule. Because again, I'm skipping over that 8 hours and I'm not counting that 8 hours in, and I'm stopping at 4:15. And there's no 30-minute rest break violation in that calculation either. So then when we go to the backside of this sleeper berth and moving forward, I'm like, okay, now where do I have to get to? So I have this rest period of 3 hours, and I'm like, what do I need to marry it to? Well, I can't marry it to this 2-hour break right here because it's not long enough. And if I have a 3-hour in the berth, I'm looking for at least 7 hours, or sorry, 3 hours off duty. I need at least 7 hours in the berth to satisfy the sleeper berth split. So I look ahead and I see 8 hours. I'm going to show you the next day in a minute, but this is an 8-hour block in the sleeper. So I go, okay, I get to stop counting at 6:15. Now we have 2 rest periods in there, and I'm going to go, okay, which one is most beneficial to the driver in this scenario? Obviously, if a rest period that's being used is more beneficial to the driver, the bigger the rest period is. So if I have the option of using a 3-hour off-duty period or a 2-hour off-duty period, which I do in this scenario because 8 and 2 and 8 and 3 both work, I'm always going to pick the 3 for the driver in this window, because then I'm not going to include that 3 hours in his work shift. And so again, when I do the driving violation, I will have a driving violation at 17:45 at 11 hours, regardless of which rest break I use, because it's still only driving time that I'm adding up. But when I go to the 14-hour rule, that one I'm not using, so I have to include it. I have to include this 2 hours. But when I do, I have a 14-hour rule violation at 17:30, and I also have a 30-minute break rule violation at 1800. Now, if I had used the 2-hour break instead of the 3, I still have the violations there, but they happen an hour earlier than what you currently see here for the 14-hour rule, because I would only be excluding 2 hours instead of 3 hours, and his violation would have occurred at 16:30 instead of 17:30. And again, enforcement has been instructed to give the benefit of all doubts to the driver and reduce that violation as much as possible. So they want to use the 3-hour window and not put the driver in violation until 17:30. And that's particularly important for if I'm on the side of the road and I stop your driver, and let's say I stop him at 1700. I look back and I see 2 rest periods. I have to use one of those 2. If I use the 2, your driver's in violation at 5 p.m. and I'm going to place him out of service. If I use the 3, he still has a half an hour before he goes in violation. And actually, I mean, I was always one of the nice inspectors. So if I stop him at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and I'm going to do an inspection, I'm going to say to him, okay, we're going to do an inspection. You're going to go to on duty, not driving. But when we're done, you're going to have to go in the berth for a minimum of 7 hours because I'm giving you the benefit of that 3 hours. But if you don't do that, you're going to go in violation of the 14-hour rule. And I would get him to jump in the bunk for 7 hours to validate that 3-hour berth. So it's important to know which one to use because it's always the one that benefits the driver. So then I move along and I'm just going to skip here. So this is the same graph grid. Here's your 8 hours that I told you about that goes from the second day into the third day. So we made it as far as the 6:15 on day 2. So now we're at the 8 hours. So now the first question we have to ask is, where are we going to go back to count the time on the front side of that 8 hours? Well, in this particular case, we don't want to go back to the 3, and we don't have to go back to the 3 because 8 and 2 actually qualify as a sleeper burst split as well. So if we go back to the 3, similar to what I said in the previous slide, if I go back to 7:15 there, I'm going to include that 2 extra hours from 7:45 to 9:45 in his work shift. I don't want to do that because that's going to hurt the driver. And I can go back to the 2 hours because the 8 and the 2 marry together. So I do that, and now my start line actually starts at 9:45. So I work forward from 9:45, and then I say, okay, now what am I going to marry this 8 hours in the berth to? I look forward of that, and what do I find? I find a 10 hours off. So this 10 hours off serves 2 purposes. It's 8 hours in the berth, plus it's 2 hours off duty. So it serves my purpose to validate that 8 hours in the berth from 6:15 to 2:15 because it's at least 2 hours. And it also serves as a 10-hour reset for the driver. So when we're done this last calculation, when you get to 4:15 in the afternoon on day 3, that driver's going to start off at 0 hours and we're going to move forward and we no longer have to calculate sleeper burst split anymore. So in this case here, we go to 6:15, that's our stop line, and we calculate the driving time. We have a driving violation at 0600 because if you add that time together, it's 11 hours of violation time. But when we clean that off and we do the on duty, we are not in violation of the 14-hour rule because again, that 8 hours gets excluded out and we add up the time and we're at 12.5 hours. So that's about as simple as I can make something that's complicated, maybe. So I don't know if you have any follow-up questions to that, Susan, or?
No, it was great. It just was interesting when we were going over this, that if you're using, so say that day 2 there, you have the 3 and 2 option. Even though you've used that 3 before to complete a cycle, you don't have to be stuck with it. Looking
Right.
back then, whatever's the closest, whatever's going to be best for that driver, as long as it qualifies, you can use it. And that was just interesting to me to look at.
Right.
Now, the stats that we've done, so at EROAD, over 60% of our drivers just do a single cycle. So the single cycles are pretty simple, right? To train on that. It's when you start getting into these complex where you have the 2 smaller break periods together. And so I just encourage you to look at this again, show this to your drivers, follow what Carrie says, and just make sure that the drivers understand to keep track of that drive time on either side of that sleeper berth period, but that they have the flexibility to be able to use those smaller breaks when they need to. So yeah, it looks a little bit challenging at first, but once you get used to it, actually, I think it's a little bit easier. But
yeah, I agree. It just takes some time, and it takes, like, there's a few things that you gotta keep in mind. First of all, a lot of people are calling these rest periods smaller rest periods. They're not necessarily going to be smaller. If that rest period up there in the off duty is 6 hours, 7 hours, whatever the case may be, it's still going to be excluded and it still meets the requirement. So it could, you know, we say a minimum of 2, a minimum of 3, but it truly is minimum. It could be 6 hours, 7 hours. It could be anything really up to 10 hours. I mean, once you get to 10 hours, then you've reset and you're moving on. But it's something for them to keep in mind in regard to that. And then the other thing is make sure that you don't take off duty, like that 8 hours in the berth is not in the off duty line, because if it is, or you just go straight to 10 hours off duty, those 2 rest periods on day 3, they count into the 14-hour work shift. You need something to validate them on the other end. So if that 8 hours at 6:15 through to 2:15 between day 2 and day 3 ends up being 8 hours off duty as opposed to in the sleeper, you're messing yourself up. Because now that 8 hours is going to count into the work shift because it's not forming part of a valid sleeper berth split option.
Right. So, and dumb question, but we like to ask those because we know they get asked. So you have someone that doesn't have a sleeper berth. Is this going to be available to them?
No. Simply put, no.
Yep. Obvious question, but we do get that question. So
Yeah.
you know, what's the sleeper berth? Yeah, it's there for a reason, and it's there to give that driver the extra flexibility, but it's not a regular off duty. It has to be sleeper berth. They have to have that compliant sleeper berth cab in order to use it.
Right. So going back to my previous example there where I said I stop a driver and I say to him, I'm going to be nice to him and do the inspection and then tell him to go in the berth and go to bed. If he has no berth, I can't be nice. And at that point, I'm going to go, nope, that 2 hours counts into your work shift. You have no way of satisfying and qualifying that rest period that you already had for 3 hours. So I have to count it into your 14-hour work shift. And now you're over your 14 hours. Now you're in violation. Now you're out of service and you can't leave for 10 hours because you can't satisfy the sleeper berth split.
Yes, very good. And make sure when you're doing this training that you're also explaining those compliance counters that we showed you earlier, how that will affect them. So the time they have left, because that's a majority of the calls we get on the split sleeper, is those timers say something left and the drivers don't understand. So they think it's incorrect. And that is going to happen with your drivers. They're going to say, why do I only have this much time left in my shift? And then they go do something and, oh gosh, why do I have this much more time left? I'm seeing that I'm out of shift hours, right? So make sure that they understand the logic and how that's feeding into it. The split sleeper on EROAD's ELD will be there. There isn't a, okay, I want to turn this off. So those compliance counters will be reflective of the split sleeper, regardless if you want your drivers to use it or not. So it's great to explain it to them. And again, they can have a lot more flexibility if they need to use it. So again, Carrie, another switchover question, and then we'll get to your compliance questions. So switching over, if the driver's in the sleeper berth on Monday the 28th, at midnight they have 5 hours. Can they take the extra 2 to start a 7 and 3 switching over, or what would you suggest on that?
I would suggest the same thing that I suggested before. Wait another day.
Yep.
If you're honestly trying to split the 2, like I said, up until midnight, enforcement is thinking old rules. So you've got 5 hours in the sleeper berth. Right now, 8 and 2 works. So if you follow through and make that an 8 hour in the berth, then you'll have the 8 hours in the berth following into the 29th. But that's the first rest period of a sleeper berth split. And now you're 2 hours. Theoretically, you're half in and half out. So in my mind, you're still going to be potentially in trouble if you end up thinking that 2 hours is not going to get counted into your 14-hour work shift.
Yes, so just take our advice, just wait another day. If they're doing a split sleeper, have them do it the old way, and then on the 29th on Tuesday, you start new and you're all good to go and your driver will be safe, because that's what we want. It's one day, and then if they go back and audit and if there's anything that comes into question, that's when you get into the splitting hairs there.
Yeah.
But
I mean, wait till the 30th, or wait until your driver has taken the 10 hours off between the 28th and 29th. Once he's got 10 hours off and he's reset and he's coming back to work, if it's 6 a.m. on the 29th, now you're into the new rules completely. Just don't try to bridge a sleeper berth pairing between the 28th and 29th. It will be problematic.
yes. So great advice. So roadside enforcement. So Carrie, after 9/29, can the driver still use the old rules? Basically looking at that 30-minute rest break. If they have a company policy that says you have to take it in off duty, they can do that.
Yeah,
And
they still can. They're gonna, because they'll be satisfying the new rules if they do that. So like I said earlier, there really isn't anything that if you stay on the old rules, if you decide you want to stay on the old 8 and 2 sleeper berth split and that's all you want your drivers to do, and you're in your mind thinking that that 2 hours is being added into the work shift all the time, as you saw in those slides, I mean, you're gonna theoretically have your driver stopping work 2 hours earlier than a roadside enforcement person is going to. So it's of no ill effect on a motor carrier to stay under the old rules, but no enforcement folk will be writing old rule violations or looking for old rules. So
there you go. And then also on the ELD, those counters, just note, so EROAD's ELD, those numbers for your drive shift cycle and then time left until break are going to be reflective of the new rules. So if you have company policies and you want to use those old rules, that's fine. Just note that the driver will see something different. So just make sure that you're aware of that. No matter what system that you're using, make sure that you deal with that with your training. And then Carrie, what about EROADs? So is FMCSA going to have the new rules uploaded into EROADs, and how has EROADs changed?
yes, as far as I've been told and I'm aware, they are working currently on updating EROADs to the new rules. So when you transfer your files from an ELD into EROADs for the inspector to look at roadside, they will be translated into the new rules for all the things we've just talked about. I haven't heard anything otherwise.
Okay. Will there be, for the split sleeper, in particular, any soft enforcement period, like they cut the driver some slack?
Not that I've been told, but I mean, to be honest with you, I mean, soft enforcement always comes with like I told you, this is difficult for the enforcement community to understand and update and enforce as it is for the motor carrier industry to understand. So lots of times, and I'll be the first one to admit it, when something changed in the regulation and I'm out at the roadside and I'm looking at something and I'm a little hesitant because it's new to me, I have my own soft enforcement policies when I'm not really sure. Now, in the case of ELDs and in the case of EROADs, the officers will have the ability to look at the EROADs file, and it does help them with potential violations. So it pinpoints for them where potential violations may be. So it may be easier for them to find them and deal with them. And then again, it's just up to the discretion of the inspector at the time. I have not heard of any soft enforcement periods from the federal government.
Would it be good for a motor carrier to go to FMCSA site and to do the practice EROADs where they could upload their driver logs to kind of see?
Yeah,
the split sleeper?
It wouldn't hurt. And then at least they know what the inspector's looking at. Sure.
There you go. So if you don't know how to do that, Carrie and I's contact information is at the end of this presentation. Just let us know and we'll show you where to go to that link, so where you can practice yourself to see what that would look like after 9/29. Any new CVSA inspection bulletins regarding the new rules that can be helpful, or for enforcement to be helpful for enforcement?
Not so much on these new rules per se. The new rules, at this point, the new rules are so new that our inspection bulletins are usually written after the fact when we find out what issues are, and it hasn't been implemented yet, so we're not sure. But I will tell you that next week is our conference, and we are looking at updating an ELD bulletin that's been on our website for several years, but it needs to be updated with some more enforcement guidance and things like that. That, you know, there's been vendors, including EROADs, that have been helping us with that. So I'm hopeful that we will have updates to that bulletin by the end of the month. But it won't be specific to the hours of service rules. It will be more specific to ELD, technical spec, enforcement type guidance. So look for that, because it's important for industry to know what those are.
Yes, that is good to know. And then what are the main things that enforcement you think we'll be looking at post the switchover, like that week, the next week? What do you think is going to look like roadside for drivers?
I don't think a whole lot will change. I think that you'll see enforcement officers still asking for the ELD transfer files to be sent to EROADs so that they can have a look at the graph grids. I really don't see a whole lot changing from an enforcement standpoint at roadside. The only thing that I may see is, or that I may suggest, and it kind of goes back to that soft enforcement, that they'll be looking at the new rules and, you know, if a driver, and I can't say this for certain because it would just come back to the discretion of the officer, but you know, if I see something that's just off a little bit, I might say to the driver, hey, are you aware that the rules changed, and whatever the case may be, and I might be lenient for a week, but there's been no guidance in that regard at all. So as far as I can tell you, as of the 29th, they will enforce the new rules, and enforcement can do whatever they want.
Yeah, well, thinking it should be a lot less violations, especially with a 30-minute rest
Should
break,
be.
I would
Yes.
assume.
Yes, for sure. That,
And
I
then,
mean, in my mind, that 30-minute rest break is going to take care of itself for the most part. Drivers will really not have to think about it that much because it will just happen throughout their day.
yeah. So with the split sleeper, getting back to that, so can you kind of explain how that you guys have been trained on that? And maybe that can give some of the listeners some inspiration on how to train their drivers.
Yeah, the one thing that I wanted to point out to people, because it gets asked a lot, is this log here that you see below. You've got the 3 hours off between 7 and 10 in the morning. And so I stop a driver, let's say at 2 o'clock. I don't know that he's going to go into the berth at 5 p.m. That hasn't happened yet. The day is progressing. So right now, if an inspector stops you at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on this particular day, that 3 hours, it may be qualified by a berth, but it's always added into the 14-hour rule. So they don't really care that much about it, and they always take that 3 hours and add it into the 14-hour rule, because that's how the rule is today. But moving forward, if I stop you at 3 o'clock and you're in the process of doing an appropriate sleeper berth split, I have to give the driver the benefit of that 3 hours. You have to. So you can't, an inspector can't say, well, I don't know what he's going to do in the future, so I'm going to add that 3 hours into his work shift, and I'm going to put him at 14 hours at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I can't do that. So at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, if I stop this guy, I don't have him on duty 14 hours. I only have him on duty at that point for 11 hours, because I'm going to exclude that 3 hours. Now, the next question that comes up from the enforcement community is, well, how do I know he's going to satisfy that if he hasn't done it yet? Well, there you go again. It's give the benefit to the driver. You might want to tell the driver, hey, you've got another hour before you got to jump in that berth. And if you don't, then that 3 hours is going to get incorporated into your work shift. Either that or you're going to go in violation, one of the two. So, you know, if there's two options for an inspector at that point. If they really truly don't believe that the driver is going to satisfy the requirements of the sleeper berth, providing he has one on the truck. If he doesn't, that's different. But if he does, then they can go to the motor carrier 2-3 days later and ask for the logs and see whether the driver did what he was supposed to do, or in some cases, a compliance review or something like that will find it at a later date. And it is what it is, to be honest. It's like, if the driver didn't satisfy the requirement and ends up going in violation and was in violation when I actually stopped him because that 14-hour rule, 3 hours got counted in, so be it. I didn't have it at roadside at the time of stop. It may transpire into a violation later on that day, depending on what the driver does. But that's how they're instructed to deal with it.
So that's good to know, and it's very important for you when you're training your drivers. Make sure they're aware to talk to enforcement. If they're using the split sleeper, have them say, I'm using a split sleeper. I'm in the process. I've done my first split. Now I'm going to pair it with a 7. Have them talk like that. If they know what they're talking about, there's more potential for them to be successful, right? But if they say, you know, if the enforcement says, hey, so I see 3 hours in off duty, are you going to do a split? And they say, what? Huh? What? So just help them out. Help your drivers out. Help them talk the talk, do the splits, do the cycles, train them, and have them not be shy when talking to enforcement and explaining what they're doing and what they're. So if they're going to do a split sleeper, they obviously have to do some time management, looking at the road ahead, where they're going to stop and where their deliveries are. So make sure they're aware of that. Enforcement is going to help them as much as they can, and hopefully Carrie's relayed that you know, it's not against the drivers. We're trying to help the drivers as much as possible, especially with this rule, I think.
Right. And the other thing, you know, it's the same thing that I said to industry when ELDs came in. Like, ELDs were new to inspectors. They knew no more about ELDs than the driver at the side of the road with whatever ELD they had. But I've said it 1,000 times. It's like there's over almost 500 ELDs on FMCSA's website, and your driver has one. That driver needs to know how to use that thing upside down and backwards, and he needs to understand the rule that he's using to drive his truck as good as the enforcement official. And then Susan's right. It's like if you are stopped on the side of the road and asked to transfer your ELD files and asked for your malfunction card and you're asked for the user manual, and that driver can click, 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 bang, bring up all of that stuff. It's all electronic. He can find it all. He can transfer his files. And then if I'm looking at this log and I go, hey, you were off duty from 7 to 10, what are you planning on doing? And he says, well, I'm going to just go up here an hour and I'm going to jump in the bunk for a minimum of 7 hours because I need at least 7. I'd go, okay, this guy knows what he's doing. And it would be, and I would go, okay, he knows what he's doing. I know where that truck stop is that he's telling me about, because inspectors do know their locations. So if you're telling me you're going up to the Flying J to nap for 7 hours and I know it's 45 minutes away, I totally know that that was your plan. And I probably will not give it another thought. But to Susan's point, if you go, what, I needed to take a break in an hour, now I'm starting to wonder whether you actually understand the rule.
Okay, wonderful. So I know we said we had more time for question and answer, so we're going to get to questions and we're going to go a little bit over. Carrie, are you okay with that, going about 5 over?
Yeah, I'll bill you for it later. I'm kidding.
Okay. Okay. So here we go. Brittany, let's get right into those questions.
Yes, wonderful information. We do have quite a few questions. So like Susan said, we'll go a little over time. Stay on if you can, but if not, we will send the recording out. The first question, we had a few questions that about the sleeper berth that I just wanted to clarify quickly. So should we be training our over the road and regional drivers to be using sleeper berth instead of off when they're on sleep break? Carrie?
Not necessarily. I mean, again, they have to be in the sleeper berth in order to put it in the sleeper berth. So it depends on what they're doing. So I mean, I can suggest that they should put it in sleeper berth if they have a sleeper and they're in the sleeper. Like, you can't put sleeper berth if you don't have one and you're not in it. Like, I've had drivers do that, and I know they're both off-duty statuses, but in reality, you need to be in the berth to log that time. And yes, it could be beneficial. So if you are now, for instance, sitting at a loading dock and they go, we're not ready, and you have a berth, well, if you jump in the berth and you think it's going to be a 5-hour wait and it ends up being a 7-hour wait, well, now you're in the berth for 7 hours and you can actually use that towards a berth split. So yes, it's possible that it will be beneficial moving forward based on the unknown that's ahead of you. So potentially, yes, it would make sense to use the berth, but you've got to get in it.
Yeah, and only if they have one in the truck, not if they're going to stay at a hotel or something. Is that correct?
That's right. That's exactly right. Like, it's like, do not use sleeper berth if there isn't one in that truck.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Okay, great. Next question, Susan, you might be able to answer this one. How is EROAD handling the split sleeper berth in terms of pausing the on-duty countdown clock? Is it assumed that the driver is using the split if they take a 2 to 3 hour break? And if so, what happens if the driver doesn't take the second break to satisfy the split?
So if we stop the clock if they have that period, but then if they do not take that second part of the break, they are going to be in violation. So, and that's where it gets really interesting and tricky with those compliance counters. And Carrie can attest to this. We went through quite a bit of scenarios, like, because the ELD isn't psychic. It can't, and it's not like an enforcement officer can ask questions and say, hey, you're going to do this or whatnot. So it's giving the driver the benefit. But if they don't pair it, then it is going to put them in violation. So yes, that 14 hours will stop as long as that part of the cycle is started. And then it will be paired, but it has to have that second period or that larger period be in the sleeper berth and married in order for it to be compliant and not throw an hours of service violation on the violation report.
Okay, great. And if you had any follow-up questions to that answer, please, feel free to email us and let us know. Our next question, can the 30-minute break be taken within the 8 hours of driving or only after the 8 hours of driving?
If I understand that question correctly, if you take the 30-minute break inside of 8 hours of driving, you're actually resetting the clock. So that question doesn't really make sense, because if I drive for 4 hours and then I take 30 minutes off and I drive for another 4, I'm not at 8 hours of driving. I'm at 4 hours of driving. I took a break. Now I'm at 0 hours driving. I drive 4 hours. I take a break. I'm at 0 hours driving. So it doesn't really, if you go on duty not driving for 30 minutes at any time or a combination thereof, it resets the clock.
Okay, yep, great.
And that's what was confusing about those compliance counters, is you might have the driver go, wait a minute, it's at 0 or it's at 8 again. I didn't take an off-duty period, or it didn't count, or it's not counting. So it's good to train on that. And EROAD, getting back to the other question, Brittany, EROAD, we're going to have some training videos that come out next week that will help with the split sleeper and those other things and how those compliance counters will work. So be looking for those.
Good. And I think on top of that, we're going to also create an FAQ document that we will send out as well with some of these common questions that you all have been having around these two more difficult to understand changes in the hours of service. So you can look forward to that too. If you feel like some of this was still confusing, we'll have additional documentation. Our next question, will taking the 3 and 7 or 2 and 8 in the sleeper berth add up to reset your time to 10 hours off duty for the day, or do you still have to take another 10 hours off duty to get all of your timers to 0?
If I
Carrie, I'll
understand
let you do that. Yeah.
Yeah, if I understand that question correctly, it's talking more about the counters on the ELD. So the only way you're going to get an ELD counter to go back down to 0 is to take 10 consecutive hours off. If you're doing sleeper burst split 8 and 2, 7 and 3, your counters will never be at 0 because you're always pulling time from the past. When you do sleeper burst split, you always have to add the time ahead and behind the rest period as you move forward. So it never recalculates your time frame down to a 0. The only thing that does that is a 10-hour consecutive time off.
Okay, great.
Does that make sense, Susan, based on the question?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Okay, and looks like let's do one more question and then we'll have to close out for the day. What about the case of a driver who stops multiple times for 2 hours? We have a few drivers that go to Chicago who get 2 or 3 breaks of 2 hours because of dock delays. The reason that this question is raised is because a popular consulting firm stated in their presentation that the stopped clock or extended clock does not apply to drivers who land at home. I assume that this has to do with the 14-hour.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's sort of like, if I'm picturing the question in my mind, it's sort of like that day 2 that I had on the graph grid, except you may have 2 or 3 or 4 different small breaks in between. The theory is the same. You can only use one. So on the front of that period of all these little 2 hours, and on the back, you have to have a 7 and 8 in the berth. Otherwise, all of those time frames are going to add up into the 14-hour rule. It doesn't matter if there's 1 there, 3 there, or 5 there. If you go from 10 hours off to 10 hours off, forget the berth, like I'm driving a day cab and I've got 10 hours off duty and I start my day and I have 3 2-hour breaks inside of the window, and at the other end of the window, I have another 10 hours off duty. All of those 2 hours are going to count into the 14-hour work shift, because the only way that you can eliminate those breaks, those 2 hours and 3 hours out of the work shift, is if you have, in the case if they're all 2, you're going to need 8 hours in the berth on the front of it and 8 hours of berth on the back. And you're only going to exclude 1 short period. So if there's 3 in there, just like my example was with the 3 and the 2, we excluded the 3 but we included the 2. So in your case, if you have 8 in the berth, 3 2-hour periods off in the middle, and then 8 in the berth on the other side, you can exclude 1 2-hour in the middle, and the other 2 hours will count towards the 14-hour work shift. You can't exclude them all. You can only exclude 1.
But it's where your recalculation point. So if you're looking forward, they're going to pair it with the one closest, right?
Yep.
And then looking back, they're also going to pair it with the one closest.
Right. And then you're going to count everything in between to see. But in my case, without drawing something out, yes, that's simplistically the way that it works. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Great. Well, we are 5 minutes over time, and I appreciate everyone staying on to listen to the question answer portion. We are going to wrap up here. So Susan, maybe switch it to the next slide so people can see the contact information, because I know people will have more questions. We'll try and send out, like Susan mentioned, more videos on how to use this on the EROAD ELD. We're going to send an FAQ document on some of the questions that you asked here. And we will be sending out the recorded presentation and the slides to the recording. So thank you so much, Carrie, for joining us today. And Susan, you're wonderful as always. And to all of you for joining us, thank you so much.
Thanks, you guys.
Thank
September 29th, here we go. All good. Be safe out there.